Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Rhoda Shermer, and I want to welcome you on behalf of North Jersey Public Policy Network. It was some years ago that we did our first program on the issue of Wall Street and the bailout, and we thought that enough time has gone by, and many want to know what is the update, what's happening today. And we've planned a great program with two phenomenal speakers. So I'm glad you're here to enjoy it. I want to introduce our speakers. Christine Cumming, who will be first, is going to make a short presentation. And then both she and our speaker, William D. Cohen, will have a conversation about the issues. So let me introduce you to Dr. Cumming. Christine retired in June 2015 as first vice president and COO of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. In her 35-year career at the bank, she served as director of economic research, as senior VP leading analysis and examination units in bank supervision, and senior analyst in the international capital markets staff. Her work has focused on topics such as financial innovation, the capital and liquidity of financial institutions, and approaches to dealing with failing large banks. She was active in the work of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, and before retiring, Chris chaired the Cross-Border Crisis Management Group under the Financial Stability Forum, involved in coordinating resolution planning for large banks. She is currently a visiting scholar in the economics department of Rutgers University. William D. Cohen, who has spoken for us once before, is the former senior mergers and acquisitions investment banker at Lazard Frères, Merrill Lynch, and J.P. Morgan Chase, and is the best-selling author of The Price of Silence, Money and Power, How Goldman Sachs Came to Rule the World, House of Cards, A Tale of Hubris and Wretched Excess on Wall Street, and The Last Tycoons, The Secret History of Lazard Frères. He is contributing editor at Vanity Fair, Deal Book, New York Times, and writes for the Financial Times, Bloomberg News, Business Week, The Atlantic, and others. Bill is a regular on MSNBC, Bloomberg TV, CNN, PBS News, Charlie Rose, and appeared 3 times with Jon Stewart. So please welcome our two terrific speakers, and we'll start with Dr. Cumming.
So good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Okay, excellent. So what I'm going to do is just set the stage here a little bit about financial reform after the crisis. And the report that I thought I would start with is the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. How many of you have read that report? Not many people read it, I'm afraid, because by the time it was finished, Dodd-Frank was already in action. And so it was meant, I think, to help write Dodd-Frank, but unfortunately it came out too late. But it is a good report, and there's a certain amount of moral outrage in it, which is going to be satisfying for some people. But the bottom line is the financial crisis was avoidable. That's his first finding. And what I've done in the next slide is just summarize ultimately the themes that appear in this report. The first is that risk-taking occurred that was far beyond the capacity of large financial institutions to bear it, as well as other parts of society, including the household sector. The inability to put failing institutions into resolution once the crisis started to move forward. There was nowhere to go but government bailout. Third, governance failures that allowed business strategies to distribute risks in complex forms to clients ill-equipped to understand them. So that's how all that stuff got sold that eventually blew up. And finally, the government's inability to identify systemic risk in a timely manner and act promptly to stem it. So those are really 4 important themes from that Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. So this picture is meant to distill those findings further and say there are really 4 pillars of financial reform. The first one is capital and liquidity, C. Resolution is R. G is governance, and S is for systemic risk. And so let's start with the risk-taking beyond the capacity to bear losses. The reforms have focused on improving capital and liquidity at firms. The capital has been the big focus of attention that grabs the press, and there has been a big rise in not just the amount of capital that large institutions have to hold, but also in the quality of capital. The reality was that the regulators had allowed a lot of what are essentially debt instruments to be considered the capital of banks, when in fact equity is the real loss-absorbing capacity at financial institutions. And so that was a big focus of reform. In addition, during the crisis, to help stabilize the situation, the regulators came up with these industry-wide stress tests for the largest financial institutions. And those stress tests really are an amazing effort to try and understand how a stressful period, such as something like our financial crisis, would impact firms were it to occur going forward, and to determine whether they had sufficient capital to weather the storm. And that includes not only a focus on losses they might take, but also on what happens to their income, because one of the important things that happens during a stressful period is income tends to dry up. So those stress tests are probably the real binding constraint on financial institutions today in terms of their ability to pay dividends or to do share buybacks or anything like that. They have to pass the stress test. And the stress test is both quantitative and qualitative. They have to, the firm that is, has to demonstrate that it can do planning, capital planning, that is reasonable over time. And as you can see from this picture, which is the total common equity, ratio of common equity to risk-weighted assets, you can see that by the time the crisis was just starting, or was in the kind of in the middle, capital ratios, that particular capital ratio, which again is about equity, was below 6%, and today it's probably something more like 13 or 14%. Resolution, another problem. Lehman Brothers failed, but it failed in a bankruptcy that, as you know, helped to add to the panic rather than reduce the panic during the crisis. And so there's been a tremendous amount of work to try and come up with a resolution regime very similar to what the FDIC uses for banks, usually small and medium-sized banks, not giant banks. And that was that challenge of coming up with a resolution regime. It was considered really, difficult, intractable problems, especially in a cross-border context. So a great deal of work has been done. There is a new set of standards that all countries need to meet that would give a special resolution regime for financial institutions, a resolution authority. In this country, it's the FDIC, as you know, and the ability really for them to have the powers to be able to put a firm through an insolvency proceeding. And one of the key breakthroughs is this fourth point down, a mechanism to recapitalize a failed institution. So a failed institution will have lost a lot of its capital, it have absorbed a lot of losses. What does it need? More capital to be able to resurrect itself, come out of the insolvency state. And where does that come from? In a corporate bankruptcy, it comes from the debt of the firm. The poor debt holders are converted into equity holders. That is essentially what is being proposed for banking companies as well in the resolution state. And then even here in the US, we've made changes. So the FDIC only dealt with banks, not even bank holding companies. And that's been changed through a three-key process. The FDIC, the Federal Reserve, and the Secretary of the Treasury all have to agree, but the FDIC can use special powers to resolve a non-bank institution if it's viewed as systemic, or the whole banking company, including the holding company, again, if it is viewed as systemic. And the last point on that particular slide is something that's breaking news. So the 8 banks have been filing, the 8 largest banks in the US, which includes 2 investment banks, have been filing living wills. And just about 2 weeks ago, the Fed and the FDIC announced that only one firm had passed writing a living will, had written an acceptable living will, and the rest of them failed, either both organizations, both the Fed and the FDIC, or one of them. So this is still going on. Yes?
Define what a living will is for a bank, please.
Absolutely. So a living will is kind of, as it sounds like, the bank writes the failure plan. The bank describes how it can go into bankruptcy, not insolvency, not an FDIC insolvency, but a bankruptcy in a way that would be orderly and would not cause a lot of problems. So this is a really tough test, a really tough test. But there was an institution, Citibank, which apparently passed the test, and according to press reports, and then there are 7 other banks that still have a lot of work to do to be able to do that. Yes?
Do you mean the living will show that they passed the test, or the test was simply to write them?
They wrote a living will, and then it was reviewed by the Fed and the FDIC, and they get to say pass, fail. So. Okay, on to the next thing. Identification of systemic risk. So there are a lot of changes here in that Dodd-Frank made to try to make it easier, not just to identify systemic risk, but also to coordinate the regulators in addressing a potential systemic risk. Now, a good example of that, of course, was the housing bubble that occurred before the crisis. To that end, Congress created the Financial Stability Oversight Council, the FSOC, and that is where systemic risk gets discussed, and where one more really important power has accrued to the FSOC, and that is to designate non-bank systemically important financial institutions. So right now there are 4 of those, or there are 3.5. There's AIG, there's GE Capital, there's Prudential, and there's MetLife. And as you know, MetLife went to court and won the first round. The Treasury has filed an appeal. But basically the court found that the systemic risk designation for MetLife was not appropriately, the foundation wasn't sufficient, and so that's been reversed. But this was an important power meant to be there for the FSOC, so that if institutions become very large, very interconnected in global markets, that they would be subject to the same kind of oversight that large banking companies get. And so that's why there is this non-bank designation. But it's controversial, and the first round in the courts were lost for at least one of these companies. And the FSOC has the authority to designate these non-banks. And then there's also, outside of the United States, there's an organization called the Financial Stability Board. How many of you have heard of that? This is something that was created essentially by the G20. How many of you have heard of the G20? Yeah, so G20 is like the 20 most important countries in the world. And they created this FSB, and the FSB has been carrying out a reform agenda, and they too have a systemic risk monitoring capacity. Many countries have established, designated a systemic risk authority in the effort to try and figure out systemic risk. And so the last point here is that it's also really important that the governance within financial institutions is strengthened. And so the real financial reform is not really possible unless the firms themselves say, we have a problem, there is a problem with the way we are operating, and we need to change it. You can write all the regulations in the world, but then it just becomes a compliance exercise if there's not really commitment within the firms to address the deep problems that created the crisis. The next crisis is likely to be different. That's another reason why it's important that the firms themselves embrace what went wrong and what they need to do better. I always look back to the early 1990s, and that was a period when firms actually had to make a lot of changes. They embraced the fact that we had this big real estate and LBO problem. How many of you remember that? A lot of big banks were in pretty bad trouble. And there was basically a program for them, and I use that as a benchmark. They were asked to draw up capital and liquidity plans. They put their problem assets into workout. And the third, and probably most important thing, was to develop a new business plan. The old business plan is what created all those bad assets. So you need, how you're going to make money in the future, not the way you did before. And you can look today at what's happened, and we've seen that banking companies have increased their capital and liquidity, a great deal, as we saw in that earlier chart. Second, most of those problematic exposures here in the U.S., not necessarily all abroad, have been, dealt with in one way or another, sold, managed, whatever. So they're not they're not continuing to be the problem. But when you look at the last point, it's not really clear. Some firms have made some changes to their business model, but the question is, how much real change has there been? Has there been enough? So I'll give this a report card. Where do I think we are relative to those 4 pillars? Capital and liquidity, good progress, no question about it. Resolution, there's been surprising progress. We've seen a number of breakthroughs. In my personal view, we could actually try to resolve a financial institution. That's a bold statement. Systemic risk, a good start, but the challenge here is always going to be when you see that housing bubble, when you see that next big problem, are you really going to act? And are you going to act early enough to make a difference? And the last is governance. I think, my own view is we need more business model reform. We need more engagement. We need more willingness to say something went wrong here. Whoops. So here's my last slide. We have capital pillar is looking pretty strong. The resolution pillar is, kind of getting in there. Governance, work in progress, still really trying to get it, upright. And the systemic risk is just a little bit short, but we'll see when things get tough whether the regulators act. So that's my introduction and a little bit of landscape. And what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Bill to talk a little bit about his view of how much progress we've really made.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Can you all hear me? Pretty good? Okay. All right, so I guess pretend that isn't there. Maybe it'll go up miraculously. So this is the first I've met Chris, and she's had a very distinguished career at the Fed in New York, and that's, oh, there we go. And that's very impressive and important. And so I just have a completely different view of this. I think it's nice to put things on PowerPoint slides makes people feel good, it makes people feel like there's actual progress. But my background is completely different. I spent 20 years in the trenches on Wall Street, and I've spent the last 15 years writing about Wall Street. I've written books about what happened in the crisis, the collapse of the crisis, why it happened. I continue to write about why, frankly, these nice pillars that, again, Chris spoke lovingly about and are very lovely, really are, frankly, not particularly relevant to, and are a way to make, and again, I hate to be too cynical about it, but I'm sorry, that's what Rhoda wants me to do, that's what I do. And they just are not relevant to the real world. I mean, it's nice, it's very nice to talk about capital, and there is much more capital now in the domestic U.S. banks, the big banks, than there ever has been before, and that's probably important. You know, the thing is that we will never really know about any of these things until the next crisis comes along, and I assure you, despite wind down authority, despite living wills, despite all these nice bells and whistles that the Fed is putting and talking about, and stress tests and all of that, I mean, I can't tell you how ironic it is to me that Chris just spoke about Citigroup being the one bank that passed the living will test. Citigroup is the bank that is in the worst financial condition of any of our big banks. So to give you an idea, you know, the fact that it was the bank that needed a $40 billion bailout and then a $300 billion ring fencing. And if it hadn't been for Bob Rubin's connections with the Treasury and the Fed when he was in the senior management role at Citigroup would have gone bankrupt. And Citigroup really hasn't done much recently to improve its financial condition. It has separated bad assets from good assets, but it's still the weakest performing big bank that we have. And the fact that it's passed the stress test, to me, shows you that the stress test or the living will or whatever it is that Chris is calling it is a completely irrelevant a test. Now, again, it makes people feel good, and it's a one-day story, and the press gets all excited about it, and there's a scorecard, and they passed, and Goldman Sachs didn't pass, so whoop-de-doo. Okay. The truth is, I would like to just spend a minute telling you why this financial crisis happened. Okay, and the truth is that none of the things that Chris has talked about or the Fed is doing, with the possible exception of requiring more capital and sort of mandating that these banks get out of some of the risky businesses that they had been in, is going to help. But I would argue that as part of the Fed's decision and Paul Volcker's decision and the Treasury's decision and Dodd-Frank's mandating to force banks to get out of some of their riskier businesses, they've also stifled innovation at banks. They've also forced banks to take less good risk. You know, there's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. There's good risk and bad risk. You really don't know what bad risk is until it's almost too late. And so when you prevent all risk from taking place, you are basically you're stifling the financial system at a time when actually you don't want the financial system to be stifled. Let me just tell you, in my judgment, why Wall Street found itself in a predicament that it was in 2007 and 2008. And it really goes back, in my mind, to the early 70s. You have to understand the history of Wall Street to really appreciate why the condition that we're in now is not something that's actually going to benefit us, that's actually going to hurt us. And to me, it all gets down to incentives. People on Wall Street are driven, and the word incentive does not even appear in Chris's presentation. It probably doesn't appear, although I haven't done a word check, in Dodd-Frank law, which is 2,200 pages, and certainly the Fed and the Dodd-Frank law and the Volcker rule does nothing to address the problems of incentives on Wall Street, and it's all about incentives. So when these laws and these regulations and these presentations and these closed-door seminars go on and don't mention anything about incentives and what people get rewarded to do, then in my mind, you are completely missing the elephant in the room and what motivates people. So, a little history. So, for a long time, so, Wall Street, believe it or not, was sort of a thriving trading enterprise when New York was called New Amsterdam and the Dutch controlled it, and even under the British when it became New York, it was a thriving sort of a mercantile area, including, unfortunately, doing a boom business in the trading of slaves. And Wall Street is really, there was literally a wall that was built on the northern edge of the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam to protect the settlers of New Amsterdam, the Dutch, from the Indians. They were afraid that they were going to get attacked by the Native Americans. And by the way, the Dutch did their share of attacking the Native Americans, so and massacring the Native Americans. So it was probably mutual fear that they built this wall. And then the British were the ones that took the wall down, and it became a street that connected the East River with the Hudson River. And it was a thoroughfare that allowed boats to come to the East River and then go across the highway, as they called it, to the Hudson River, which was then called the North River, and it became a street of enterprise. Over time, it became New York, and Wall Street became the capital of the United States, and then that moved to Philadelphia, and then to Washington, and then Wall Street became a city, street of commerce, and it became the what I call the left ventricle of capitalism. And so from 1790s, when it resurrected itself after the Revolutionary War, until 1972 or thereabouts, Wall Street was made up of a series of very small, undercapitalized private partnerships where family members of various families, in the case of Goldman Sachs, it was the Goldman family and it was the Sachs family, and they had actually intermarried among the family because they didn't want to dilute the capital of the firms. And they didn't want to take any risk because it was their own money, and they were in a very simple business, but a very important business of basically raising capital for companies that need it, that could be sold in public offerings or debt offerings. And basically that was the business of Wall Street for a very long time. They managed people's money, they gave some investment advice, they gave advice about some small mergers and acquisitions, but basically they were in the business of trying to make money on their money, taking very little risk, and preserving their firms because they had 4 or 5 partners. They didn't want to take partners from the outside. They didn't want to dilute their capital or their holdings. And so Wall Street was a very dangerous place because sometimes your partners could do something stupid that would cause your firm to go out of business, and there really wasn't much you could do about it. But it didn't cause any systemic risk because there basically was no system to fall apart, and there was very little interconnectedness between the firms. So I won't go through, how Wall Street helped cause the problems in 1929 and various crises along the way, but I think things began to change really for the worse, even though for the worse for all of us, the better for the Wall Street firms. In 1972, when a firm by the name of Donaldson, Lufkin, Jenrette, DLJ, decided to go public. And it used to be a New York Stock Exchange rule that firms that were part of the stock exchange could not be public firms. They had to be private partnerships. But DLJ decided to defy that rule, and they decided that they were going to go public despite the rule. And they went public, and so they brought in other people's money into the firm. They did an initial public offering in 1972. It was a very successful initial public offering. All the old partners became very rich. They then had very easy and cheap access to capital, and they were able to do things that other firms on Wall Street were envious of. And they were trading, most firms, the partners would put their capital in at book value, and then if they wanted to leave the firm, they had to take it out at book value. In other words, they didn't get a return on their capital. But DLJ was trading in the public markets at 2 and 3 times and 4 times book value. So partners who think they, had $1 million worth of capital suddenly had $4 million worth of capital. And everybody at DLJ was getting very rich. They were able to use the stock market as a succession plan to buy out old partners and bring in new partners. And they were able to get capital cheaply to do other things like trading and underwriting that they wanted to do. And next thing you know, they had a competitive advantage on all the other firms on Wall Street. And slowly but surely, one firm after another decided that they would emulate DLJ and go public. And so what you did over time, ending, Goldman Sachs famously went public after many tries or much internal dispute in May 1999, and that became the last big firm to go public after Bear Stearns and Morgan Stanley and First Boston and Salomon Brothers and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and until finally firms, even some of the smaller firms like Lazard, where I worked for a long time, that finally went public in May of 2005, and nobody ever thought that firm would go public, and now even the smaller firms are going public. And lo and behold, all these people who worked at all these firms have gotten really, really rich because they went public and they took other people's money inside the firms, and they had access to very cheap capital, and they began to be rewarded to take risks with other people's money. Well, people on Wall Street like to work there because they can make a lot of money. And it was hard to make a lot of money in the old days when it was just your capital and you didn't want to put too much of it at risk because you were afraid you might lose it. So when I worked at Lazard, which had been a private firm since 1848, so from 1848 to 2005, I wasn't there from the beginning, but I was there for a big chunk of that time. And it was owned by a French man named Michel David, whose family had owned it since 1848. And he didn't want to go public because he didn't want to have this capital. He wanted to stay private. He didn't want anybody to know how profitable the firm was. And Lazard made a lot of money because it advised companies on M&A deals, mergers and acquisitions, and it charged high fees, and there was no capital at risk, and they were very, very profitable, and everybody made a lot of money, and he didn't want anybody to know about that. And furthermore, he didn't want to get into have a lot of capital because he didn't want to get into businesses that required capital, like underwriting stocks and bonds, or underwriting junk bonds, or proprietary trading, or trading stocks and bonds, or derivatives, or mortgage-backed securities, or all the things that other firms got into over time when they had other people's capital available to them without any of their own money on the line. And so what happened over time is Wall Street went from a partnership culture where partners were rewarded for taking prudent risks with their own money to a bonus culture where everybody was rewarded for taking big risks with other people's money without any accountability. Now, this is a very interesting change in how Wall Street operates. And for people to think that there wouldn't be consequences about that is just plain stupid. And of course, the regulators had no idea what was going on. They didn't know that other people's money was being substituted for partners' capital. I mean, they knew on some level, but they didn't know that a bonus culture had taken over a partnership culture, where taking big risks with other people's money was rewarded instead of taking prudent risks with your own money. And when you've got other people's money to play with, and without being held accountable for it, you're willing to take big risks with it, because that's the only way. You need to generate revenue, and so you can go to the manager in the corner office and tell him you generated $100 million in revenue this year, and you wanted a $15 million bonus. And you didn't care what the other guy did or this guy did. You wanted your money or you were going to leave. You're going to take your book of business and you're going to take your marbles and go home. And that's what happened all across Wall Street. Now, the nice thing about this is it led to a lot of interesting innovation. Wall Street used to be a very sort of staid and boring business, which most smart people didn't want to have anything to do with. But over time, it attracted a lot of MBAs from top schools, and they got rewarded with a lot of money, not have to putting any of their own money in. They got rewarded with other people's money for taking risks with that money and innovating. So you had innovations like Mike Milken creating the junk bond market, or Lou Ranieri creating the securitization market, which were incredible innovations, and incredibly important innovations in what I call the democratization of capital. Lowering the cost of capital for people who wanted it, who never used to have access to it. That's a good thing, basically. But in typical Wall Street fashion, there was a lot of money to be made by the innovators. Mike Milken made a lot of money. You may remember Drexel and Mike Milken. And Lou Ranieri made a lot of money at Salomon Brothers, and Salomon Brothers made a lot of money, and all the other firms deconstructed what they had done and tried to compete with them, and basically competed out a lot of the profits, which of course is economics 101. But of course, there was a lot of excess, and by competing with each other, they lowered their credit quality standards, and that led to one crisis after another. So beginning in the 80s, as Mike Milken was making the junk bond market into a real thing, and as Lou Ranieri was making securitization into a real thing, we had one financial crisis after another. And there's not a coincidence why there was one financial crisis after another that required bailouts and freaked everybody out, and in 87 the stock market dropped 22.6% in one day. It's not a surprise, even though everybody was shocked and surprised. It's not a surprise. It's not a surprise because that's what people were rewarded on Wall Street to do. They were rewarded to take risks with other people's money. And you know, people are actually really simple. They do what they're rewarded to do. And on Wall Street, they're rewarded to take risks with other people's money, and they're going to continue to do that until they're told that they can't do that anymore. Yes, sir?
It appears you're trying to say that after 1970 or 1990, culture changed so that there would be more crashes. It seems to me, throughout the history of the United States, there were periodic panics and crashes way before this new culture appeared. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, that is true, but I would say to you, and by the way, when a panic does occur, like what happened in 1929, and firms like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan were at the center of those panics, and even those they were private partnerships, those partners misbehaved. And so when people get greedy, even in a partnership culture, as happened at Goldman Sachs and as happened at JP Morgan and other firms, then yes, that can result in people selling securities and promising things they shouldn't be promising, and bidding up the price. I mean, what happened in 1929 essentially is that everything got way overpriced. There was a panic. I mean, it was everybody sort of bought into the fact that these stocks were going to go up and up and up and up. And in fact, they were being manipulated by these Wall Street firms because they were making so much money from manipulating them. And then, of course, it all came crashing down and everybody panicked, and the rest is history. So I'm not saying that we haven't had crises in the past. We did, 1873, 1907, 1929, 1930, but basically they were far and few between. And after 1930, when the Glass-Steagall Act, which was put in, and there were other regulations like the SEC was formed, and also earlier the Fed had been formed, there were regulators who were actually doing their job as opposed to being paid not to do their job, which is what happens now because they're so anxious to cash out, especially at the SEC. They're so anxious to do their time through the SEC that they can go through the revolving door and get back to Wall Street or a big corporate law firm that will pay them a lot of money, that they basically don't do their job. And that's where we are now. But for the period from the 1930s until the 1980s, Wall Street was a relatively benign place, in large part because partners did not want to. They saw what happened in 1929 and 1930, and they saw how many people went out of business during that time, and they didn't want to. They were being more prudent with their capital. What happened, in the 1980s and ever since, is that prudence is gone. Prudence is gone because it's not their capital anymore. It's other people's money, and they're being rewarded to take risks with it. And when people are rewarded to take risks with that money, that's exactly what they'll do. And so, Wall Street has always been a dangerous place. Commerce has always been a dangerous place. We like to sanitize over it, but in truth, Wall Street under the Dutch was a dangerous place. Under the British was a dangerous place. Under the Americans, it's been a dangerous place. And firms go in and out of business the whole time. But now we've created, unfortunately, a system of interconnectedness among the firms that became life-threatening in 2007 and 2008. And that's because these firms the people who were working in these firms were just doing their jobs, taking an innovation like securitizing mortgages and taking those mortgages and packaging them up into securities and selling them off as AAA bonds all around the world. And they were rewarded to do that because they were generating revenue from the sale of those securities, and then they were making their argument to their bosses that they should be getting big bonuses, and they were getting big bonuses. So they kept doing it and doing it and doing it and larding up their balance sheets with these securities that in effect the market wouldn't take, and they essentially larded up their own balance sheets with the risk that the market was no longer interested in taking. And then they would use those securities as collateral for their short-term financing. So when banks get into trouble is that they lend long and borrow short. And even though this is a strategy that has gotten banks in trouble from time immemorial, and they would not even recommend to their own clients that they borrow short and lend long, that's exactly what Wall Street was doing. And that's why Wall Street got into trouble in 2007 and 2008, because they had created all of these securities that they were selling off like madmen and getting paid and getting big bonuses. And then as the music began to stop, they couldn't sell them anymore. They larded up their balance sheets with these securities, and then they used them as collateral for short-term overnight loans. And then when the people who were providing those loans didn't like that collateral anymore, they pulled the plug, and they didn't have enough liquidity to continue to manage their business. And so one after another, they fell like dominoes. And by the way, I will conclude with this thought, and then we can go back and forth. None of that has changed. None of that has changed. Nothing about the incentive system on Wall Street has changed. Yes, there's more capital in Wall Street firms, but when a crisis comes, in my judgment, the wind down authority is going to be meaningless, the living will is going to be meaningless, the liquidity that you think you have is going to be meaningless. I guarantee you, in the next crisis, which will come, and I think, by the way, this is another a second part of my two-pronged attack on the Fed, is that the Fed has also already created, by its quantitative easing program, its low interest rate program, the next bubbles are already seeded, and it's basically too late, and our next crisis will be upon us soon. When that next crisis hits, I can assure you that there will be no wind down authority. There will be no slow and steady dismantling of Citigroup. There's no way the government's going to let any of the big banks fail.
You've addressed so far the investment banking industry pretty much.
Well, there's no difference anymore.
Well, there's a lot of other little pieces that come into it. The reliance on investment banks go public, but the reliance on retail money coming
Absolutely.
into the system.
I agree with you. Yeah.
Need a microphone.
I don't know if you have.
Well, there's a microphone.
There's one right there.
On the podium. Rhoda, take the microphone up there. And
So I guess I wanted to ask, when you say that it isn't just DOJ and Roth's going public, it's that it used to be that private or other public companies that wanted to raise capital would go to their banks and borrow money, where they go to the public and borrow money
Right.
All of a sudden, this advent of Wall Street is creating a tremendous reliance on liquidity in the secondary market, which is market making by these big investment banks, and then trading as a separate profit center for these investment banks with the perverse incentives that we've talked about.
Right.
I see all of this
Yeah.
with the investment banks. How would you integrate that focus or that viewpoint with the commercial banks and the fall of Glass-Steagall and the inability to regulate derivatives, all of that coming together? Can you comment on whether your analysis would apply also to the big
Yes,
commercial banks?
it does apply, and here's why. It does apply. Basically, I don't even see any difference anymore. I mean, I'm talking about, yes, I'm not talking about M&T Bank. I'm not talking about First Jersey Bank of Hackensack. I'm not talking about local banks. I'm talking about the big money center banks, the big Wall Street banks. There's no difference anymore. Once upon a time, there was a difference between a DLJ. Once upon a time, there was a big difference between commercial banks and investment banking. Commercial banks took deposits, and then they used that money to make loans. They weren't in the securities business. And then that was codified by Glass-Steagall, all 32 pages of it, in 1933 and 1934. You were given a year to choose between investment banking and commercial banking. And by the way, that only affected, as far as I can tell, two banks, two commercial banks. One, Bank of Boston, which decided to stay in the commercial banking business, and then First Boston, which used to be called First of Boston, went into the investment banking business. And it also affected J.P. Morgan and Company, which stayed in the commercial banking business. And then Morgan Stanley became Morgan Stanley, and that's why Morgan Stanley was born out of the Glass-Steagall Act. So as far as I can tell, it only affected those two banks. Goldman Sachs, there was no choice. Goldman Sachs stayed in an investment bank. Lazard stayed in an investment bank. Smith Barney, or if it wasn't around, or Bear Stearns, I don't think they were around yet, but whatever. Everyone else stayed investment banks. Okay, so that was fine, and that worked for a good long time because, in my judgment, because it was the partner's capital that was at risk, and they wanted to preserve that, and they wanted to take prudent risks. Now, what happened well before Glass-Steagall was repealed. I know everybody loves to blame all of this on the repeal of Glass-Steagall, but well before Glass-Steagall was repealed, commercial banks were doing investment banking business. They were underwriting securities. They were giving advice. I went from Lazard to Merrill Lynch to Chase to J.P. Morgan to J.P. Morgan Chase, and never once did my job change. And this was all before Glass-Steagall was repealed. Not once did my job change. I kept doing the same thing at each firm. So investment banks and commercial banks, to me, these money center banks, again, not talking about First Bank of Hackensack, have all been the same well before Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall just made, de facto what was already de jure, what was already happening. It just codified it. And it is, by the way, not true, in my judgment, that had Glass-Steagall, this crisis would have been avoided had Glass-Steagall not been repealed. That I do not believe, and I could talk about that as well. What exacerbates the problem now, and this is the Fed's doing, is, as all of you know, banks now. How do banks make money? Banks make money from money. Where do banks get money? They get it from a lot of places. But J.P. Morgan Chase, for instance, has more than $2 trillion of deposits. Whose money is that? Our money. And if you've looked at your interest rate that you get on your checking account, or the interest rate that you get on your savings account. Anybody in the audience look at that recently? Of course. It's about as close to zero as you can possibly get. So in effect, we have given, and I don't know why we do this, but we have collectively given J.P. Morgan Chase and all these other banks, J.P. Morgan Chase, more than $2 trillion of our money for free. No other business on the face of the earth gets its raw material for free. GM does not get its raw material for free. It has to pay for glass, fiberglass, steel, aluminum, rubber, electronics. Every component of a car has to be paid for. Nobody gets to work. They don't get any of their raw material for free. We have given these big money center banks all of our money for free. Thanks to the Fed, which has kept interest rates absurdly low for the last 8 years. And can't get its mind around raising the Fed funds rate by 25 basis points for fear of choking off whatever it is that we've got going on now. The truth is that Wall Street is addicted to the morphine that the Fed has provided in the form of low interest rates, zero interest rates, free money. And who benefits from free money? Not us, because we keep our savings in banks that we get rewarded with zero for. Who benefits from zero interest rates? People who make money from money every day. Who makes money from money every day? Banks, private equity firms, hedge funds, traders, speculators, the 1%. All have never had it better. Another thing that's happened because of low interest rates is that people like us are not happy with getting 0% on our savings. So we decide that's not acceptable. We have to take more risk with our money. So we are forced into riskier investments, which, by the way, is exactly what happened in the run-up to 2007 and 2008. Thanks once again to the Fed chairman, Alan Greenspan, who lowered interest rates rapidly after 9/11 from 6% Fed funds rate to about 1%. And that, in effect, had a very big effect on creating the bubble that occurred, the housing bubble that occurred in 2007 and came crashing down in 2008. And now interest rates are even lower and have been lower for longer than even Alan Greenspan did. So, that to me is a very big problem. And when you marry that with the wrong incentives, you've created a disaster waiting to happen.
So, Bill, where would you go from here if with this diagnosis, would you change the ownership structure of financial institutions today? Give us a sense of what you would do.
I've been writing about this for the last 6 years. I'm a beneficiary of the Wall Street incentive system, by the way. I know it well. I enjoyed it for many years. It's a very nice thing. But it has nothing to do with proper risk and reward. I only made money when I worked on Wall Street if I was able to successfully advise companies on buying or selling other companies. I didn't get paid unless I did that. A mortgage-backed security salesman only gets paid if he sells mortgage-backed security. A trader only gets paid if he, does successful trades. Somebody who underwrites securities only gets paid if they underwrite securities, as opposed to the old-fashioned way where the partners benefited when the pre-tax income of the firm was positive, and then that money would be distributed. So I have advocated, including on the op-ed page of the New York Times, because you're not going to make Goldman Sachs a private partnership anymore. There's not enough capital, available to take Goldman Sachs private. Okay, and then it would be so leveraged that it would be impossible to be a bank holding company, and the Fed would never approve it. So that's not going to happen. So how do you create in these firms that sense of partnership that used to exist? In fact, that they existed under for 90% of their lifetimes. So from Lazard existed as a private partnership from 1848 to 2005. It's only been a public company for 11 years. Goldman from 1860 something to 1999. It's only been a public company for 16, 17 years. Okay? So basically, the DNA of all these firms is a partnership. That's what these firms were built on. That is their DNA. So how do you get back to that? How do you get back to a sense of that? Now, I've proposed things And I think they're pretty creative, but I'm not $1,000 an hour securities lawyer. It needs some, as you've talked about, I do agree with you. There has been zero leadership in the last 8 years on Wall Street. Zero. None. No leadership. And what's desperately needed is a new leader on Wall Street. And it should be Goldman Sachs, because Goldman Sachs is still the leading firm on Wall Street. And so I've often had this debate with Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, how make me CEO for 6 months at Goldman Sachs. I will change your culture because I know you can't do it. And what I propose to do in those 6 months when I'm CEO, chairman and CEO of Goldman Sachs, and then I will leave, I'll be like that Harvard law professor who said he would run for president for one issue only, to campaign finance reform. I have one issue only, and that is to change the incentive system on Wall Street. And basically my idea would be to, Goldman Sachs has 35,000 employees, but let's face it, only 500 or so are really at the top of the firm, the ones who are running business lines, the ones who are deciding how capital should be allocated, the ones who are deciding who gets promoted and when, deciding who gets paid what and how much and when and all that. These big 500 machers of Goldman Sachs. Let's take these 500 guys, and then we'll create a little kind of a partnership, if you will, among these 500 guys. We will create a security that is collateralized by the full net worth of these 500 guys. Not just the quote-unquote stock that they've gotten from Goldman Sachs, not just whatever capital, quote-unquote, they have in the firm, which of course they don't have any anymore, or if they do, it's like negligible, but their apartments on Fifth Avenue, their houses in the Hamptons, their houses in Northwest Connecticut, their private jets, their art collections, their car collections, everything, their full net worth. And by the way, that's the way it used to be. When Mr. Goldman and Mr. Sachs and Sidney Weinberg and Gus Levy and all the great leaders of Goldman Sachs were at that firm, they had their full net worth on the line until some smart aleck lawyer came up with this idea of a limited liability corporation, and then they came up with the corporate structure to separate management from ownership. And that, frankly, did a lot of good because it generated a lot of capital and it allowed all these great companies that we're so proud of to grow. However, it was a big mistake for Wall Street firms because it encouraged them to take big risks, as I said, with other people's money and didn't hold them accountable when things went wrong. So my solution would be to create a new security, put it somewhere on the capital structure, on the right side of the balance sheet, and if things start going wrong, let's just say, for instance, that Goldman Sachs is trading at $150 a share. Let's just pick some arbitrary number. If Goldman Sachs stock falls 75%, then shareholders and creditors, or let's just take, maybe the debt is trading goes from 100 cents on the dollar or above par. Let's say it starts trading at 80 cents on the dollar. Those creditors, those shareholders would immediately be able to make claims, legal claims, against the full net worth of these 500 partners. Okay? And this can be done. I know it can be done. I know $1,000 an hour securities lawyers at Wachtell, Lipton, and Cravath, and all these smart guys can create a security, create this. And by the way, it's in the DNA of these firms. This is the way they used to exist. They knew that they had their whole net worth on the line in the old days. And so let's return to something like that. Let's take it, these 500 guys. When I interviewed Jimmy Kane, who was the CEO of Bear Stearns, Jimmy Kane was the first CEO on Wall Street to be worth $1 billion in his own company's stock. And when Bear Stearns collapsed, he lost $1 billion in his stock. And that's a lot of money to lose, especially when, like, literally a few months before you were worth $1 billion, and then come March of 2008, you're not. And so I had the opportunity to ask him what it was like to lose $1 billion of your own net worth. And instead of saying to me, oh my God, I'm devastated, I don't know how I'm going to go on, he actually said, no big deal. No big deal. Why no big deal? Because he had already taken out $400 million and stashed it away. More money than he could ever spend in his lifetime. And he wasn't talking to one of his daughters, and his other daughter was going to get whatever money he had. And he'd already converted it into houses and art and all this stuff. And so he didn't care. He didn't care. He was playing literally with the house's money. And he knew it. So yes, he lost $1 billion. Okay. Still has $400 million. I assure you he's just fine. Now, if he'd had $1.4 billion on the line instead of $1 billion, it would be a very different story. He ended up playing bridge when he completely took his eye off the ball on what was happening at Bear Stearns. So if you had these guys, in answer to your question, these top 500 guys with their full net worth on the line again, and securities that could be claimed, could be litigated for by shareholders, class action lawsuits, trustees of note holders of bond indentures could go after this, the full net worth of these guys, I assure you, they would once again be taking prudent risks with their own money. And I wrote this in the New York Times in June of 2009, and only one CEO of a Wall Street firm called me, and that was Lloyd Blankfein. Why did Lloyd Blankfein call me? Why did we talk about this for an hour? We talked about it for an hour because that's exactly the way Goldman Sachs's culture still operates. They don't have this provision, but this is the way they think still, because they were a private partnership virtually the longest of any of the big companies, and they still they are the best risk managers on Wall Street, and they still, if you look at in my book about Goldman Sachs, where I talk about how they survived the financial crisis in much better shape than any other firm and how they did it, it's because they're better risk managers, and they saw a problem coming and they did something about it. Now, they also became the poster child for bad behavior as a result, because nobody likes a winner when everybody else is losing. That's not the American way. We like to blame the winner for being successful when everything else is falling apart. So that's my solution.
And we've got a question from the audience.
So, in order to make this concept a reality, there needs to be an incentive. What would be the incentive for Blankfein to put his assets at risk?
That's a good question. And the answer actually has to do with the Fed. The New York Fed, where Chris used to work. Because what Bill Dudley has given lip service to, and unfortunately it's only lip service at this point, is he has said, and other major regulators like the head of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has said this is too, that Wall Street culture desperately needs to change. And by the way, guys, if you don't change the culture, we're going to change it for you. Now, those are idle threats. Those are idle threats. But in the last 2 years, the New York Fed has had 2 closed-door sessions. Why they're closed-door, I don't know. Maybe Chris can tell me why. They're closed-door sessions about changing Wall Street culture. So all right now is it's a bunch of lip service. But if, in fact, they were really serious and they did change Wall Street culture, my advice to Lloyd Blankfein is change your damn culture before somebody you don't like changes it for you.
Well, and so associated with incentive is also disincentive. And it seems to me that, I'm not going to say Blankfein, but any of these guys might teach Sunday school on the weekend, but when he gets to the office, he's behind the corporate veil, and there's essentially no personal liability or criminal liability. So
Apparently no. Apparently not. Even if there was criminal behavior, there's no criminal liability. That's another problem.
So is there any reality that the corporate veil could be removed?
As I wrote, a month or so ago in the New York Times, this is easy to do. It's easy to do. All it takes is a CEO who wants to do it and a board of directors who he can convince to do it. It doesn't require a regulator. It doesn't require the Fed. It doesn't require the SEC. It doesn't require Congress. It doesn't require anybody. Think of the huge, and this is my argument to Lloyd Blankfein, think of the huge public relations boom that would accrue to Goldman Sachs if it woke up one day and said, we are changing our incentive system. Nobody's asking us to do it. Nobody's telling us to do it. We're doing it because it's the right thing and it's going to make our financial system safer for everybody. I mean, it would be mind-blowing. It would be mind-blowing. It would blow up Bernie Sanders' argument. It would blow up, our politics of today.
But I haven't read that he actually did it. So.
No, he hasn't done it. That's why I need to be appointed Goldman Sachs CEO for 6 months.
I'll buy some stock.
Another question for the audience. Nope.
Getting back to the concept of perverse incentives that we read on Wall Street, which, without using the word, you're alluding to.
Of course.
Playing with other people's money, getting outsized bonuses, or generating sometimes temporary or fictitious profits with other people's money. But isn't a lot of this related to the advent, perhaps in the last 20 or 30 years, of trading as the major profit center, spec trading, proprietary trading, and not just unregulated derivatives, but trading and derivatives as a world and a benefit in and of itself, even though it's very hard to quantify the extent to which the economy directly benefits from derivatives and trading. When you have trading in derivatives and CPOs and CDOs where exponentials, throwing bad assets into a pool and then generating some kind of a bogus rating, none of that would happen if you did not allow, through regulation or otherwise, securities firms or banks to trade in those instruments and pretend that they are benefiting the economy and the citizens as a whole. Isn't that something that in its own way is just as important to eliminating perverse incentives as making Goldman Sachs partners into general partners and let everybody else be limited partners who only get paid after the generals take the risk?
I'm gonna push back on that a little bit. I don't disagree with you, but to me, trading is no different than underwriting a junk bond or selling a mortgage-backed security. In their purest form, in their abstract form, and not even in their abstract form, and actually their day-to-day form with 98%, 98%. I mean, I don't know the numbers. I'm making these numbers out, but I'm a large percentage. I mean, we want to live in a world where there's securitization because that lowers the cost of capital. We want to live in a world where small and medium-sized companies have access to the capital markets where there are high-yield securities. We want to live in that world because that allows you to get an auto loan that's relatively inexpensive. It allows you to get a mortgage that is relatively inexpensive. I mean, you want to live in that world. You want, Acme paper and shredding company in Teaneck, New Jersey, to be able to go to the junk bond market and raise capital because it's cheaper than going to the bank and getting a loan. There are fewer covenants. There's more flexibility around that capital, and it provides a higher yielding instrument for people with capital who want to get rewarded instead of just having to give our money to JP Morgan Chase for free. So you want to live in that world. And by the way, we need to live in a world where people can trade, okay? Because for every buyer of GE stock, there's a seller of GE stock. For every, $1 million, $100,000 bond of GE, there's a seller. If there aren't buyers and sellers, then there's no liquidity, and a big problem now, and again, this is something that the Fed has done, that they're very proud of. They're very proud of this, and it's a big problem in my mind. They're very proud of the fact that they are now penalizing firms for holding bonds on their balance sheet that they might use for trading purposes to make markets in various securities. They're now penalizing them. They're putting a high price of the capital usage for that. They have to use some of the precious capital against that those assets on their balance sheet. And so guess what? Banks and securities firms are saying, we're not going to make those markets anymore. And how does that affect all of us? Well, for the pensioner, people who are on pensions or on endowment funds or all those who, the bond market is 10 times the size of the stock market. all of us have bonds. Not all of us have securities, but one way or another, we hold, debt instruments, and we expect them to, be worth par. We expect them not to lose value. But when banks aren't able to make markets in those securities and somebody wants to sell them, then the price gets driven down because there's no liquidity. And the Fed is very proud of this now.
Why can't we have orderly market making and reasonable markups on trading and matching buyers and sellers without
See, my point is,
incentivized
I agree with you.
outsized profits?
I agree with you. The point is that what happens is, no, but you can't poo-poo, you can't just say hedge fund trading, okay? Because there are, in every product line, in every sector, there are people who act properly and deserve to be rewarded for that, and there are people who misbehave. Okay, and they're always unfortunately going to be, there seems to be a lot more misbehaving now because I think people's collectively have the incentive, are rewarded to misbehave. In other words, you need people to trade security. You talked about CDOs and CDO squares. Financial innovation is really, really important. And one thing the regulators have done now is they want these firms to be more utility-like. They want to stifle financial innovation. When was the last time there was financial innovation? Not in the last 8 years, I'll promise you that. They are stifling financial innovation. And it may seem okay now, but that's not really a good thing. You want Lou Ranieri to come up with securitization. You want Mike Milken to come up with the junk bond market. You just don't want the dodos who come after them, or Mike Milken himself, who got so greedy that he was stripping off warrants from his clients and trading on inside. You need to have an overall incentive system that encourages innovation, but penalizes people for their bad behavior. And the thing that I think of is this, taking the 500 smart, top guys at each of the, and women, unfortunately, most of them, we should have more women on Wall Street. We'd have less of this alpha male behavior, but that's another thing. Top 500 people at these firms and have their full net worth on the line again, so they are rewarded to be innovative, but not, but are also penalized when things get out of control. Yes.
Speaking to that 500 people, what about?
Yeah, there's a multiple position. Down at the front.
I'll repeat the question.
All right, basically what I'm saying is that within that 500 people and having an SEC, why can't the Fed incentivize those people who go after those who do that? Shouldn't there be a way?
So why don't the regulators keep people honest? Penalize bad behavior. Well, they used to, but they don't anymore. And this is a serious problem. The Justice Department has failed. The SEC has failed. The Fed is now the prudential regulator of all of these firms. The Fed, you have Bill Dudley making nice noises behind closed doors. I don't know what's going on there. We only see what they, let us see. Chris, what went on there? What did Bill Dudley tell those leaders of the Wall Street firms about changing their culture?
So I only went to the first of these because I had retired. But, again, it's trying to get the industry to talk about the need to change. And so there were speakers, and I think their speeches are available in the public, talking about that need. But those are the people that believe and have made changes. And there were lots of other people in the room. And academics were also a part of that process, talking about, long learned lessons about governance and why you have wrongdoing in firms or out of control situations in firms. But, as I said before, it takes the leaders, and there I agree with with Bill, that it's really critical that the leaders step up to the plate and say, we don't want this anymore. I remember distinctly in the early 90s, never again. People never wanted to see, the failure in lending controls and the lack of review and all of the things that contributed to this LBO and,
And that was minor in the
commercial, and it's like nothing compared to
what happened.
what happened in 2008, 2009.
And I'm sure all of you are parents, or most of you are parents. Your kids do something wrong. I'm a parent. The kids do something wrong. They need to be disciplined, or else they're going to continue to do the bad behavior. So we've just had a whole new generation of people who went through on Wall Street, who went through the 2007-2008 crisis, and no one was held responsible. No one. I'm dumbfounded that the Justice Department didn't, or hold them responsible. The SEC didn't hold them responsible.
I think they tried with Angelo Mozillo and they couldn't get him. And that's, that's shocking.
I don't buy that. They did try with the two Bear Stearns hedge fund managers, and they couldn't get them because they put on the U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of New York put on a terrible case, and they didn't use the evidence that they had, that I had even in my own book, which published before they took those people to trial. So when you don't discipline people for bad, what needs to happen is, Jamie Dimon needs to be let off in handcuffs or somebody like that, so that the story that Candide told in Voltaire after a British general lost a war and he went back home to Britain and he was killed to make an example for the others. So the other people will get the message that bad behavior is not tolerated, but that didn't happen this time. So not only does the incentive system not change, we haven't held anybody even remotely responsible, and so bad behavior is encouraged.
How do you feel about Dodd-Frank as it matters?
So in my opinion, Dodd-Frank, the Glass-Steagall Act was 32 pages long. Very clear. You have a year to choose between investment banking and commercial banking. Simple. Not complicated. And as I said, those two banks chose. They made choices. And then we had the SEC created. We had other things, the 1940 Act and all these other things, and created a safe space for a long time until, again, in my view, these firms went public. Dodd-Frank, 2,200 pages. You could take the whole thing, put it in the wastebasket, and not a thing would change. Not a thing, in my judgment, because Dodd-Frank is mental masturbation. It's a camel, which is a horse made by a committee. You had Dodd and Frank, the two leading beneficiaries of Wall Street largesse, writing this bill that became a law. It does nothing. What it is it's a full employment act for $1,000 or $1,500 an hour lawyers who are busy gutting it and watering it down. Even the great accomplishment that Elizabeth Warren loves to talk about, commercial financial,
Consumer Protection Bureau.
Pure Protection Bureau, ridiculous. You want to change behavior on Wall Street, you have to change what you reward them to do. Period. Full stop.
Bill, I'd like to respond to things that were not mentioned this evening so far about how this thing blew up. And it really took several decades to, according to some people, the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, your former boss, Alan Greenspan, with the bailout of long-term capital, private hedge fund, and it just goes on and on and on. Bill Fleckenstein, in his book, Greenspan's Bubbles, talks about Greenspan's enamor with technology and why we needed low interest rates to incentivize this technology. So there's a lot of blame to go around, and so I just like to have you respond to that.
Completely agree with you. Completely agree with you. In the Bear book, I write about the Community Reinvestment Act. Completely agree with you. Our leaders were waving the flag for home ownership. That was part of the great American dream. Everybody needed to own their home. Historically, 62% of the country were homeowners, everybody else was renters, and that was fine because some people couldn't afford to own a home or shouldn't own a home, couldn't afford a mortgage, couldn't afford to own a home, whatever it was, and they rented, and that was fine. And then the Community Reinvestment Act comes along, and Clinton is waving the flag for homeownership, and Bush is waving the flag. It was bipartisan, waving the flag for homeownership, and that went up to like 72% of the country owning homeownership. Guess what? We're probably back now at 62 again, because all that was one big round trip that should never have happened. So at the end of my book, House of Cards, which talks about the fall of Bear Stearns, I basically turned the book over to Alan Schwartz, who was the last CEO of Bear Stearns, and he gave this great soliloquy about how this all happened. And I just let him talk, and I just sort of printed it word for word. It was really brilliant summation of what happened, and it's all of those things that you've talked about, and sending the wrong signals and long-term capital management, getting Wall Street all together to bail it out. The best signal that the Fed could have sent this time around was to let Bear Stearns fail. If they had let Bear Stearns go into bankruptcy, then I assure you, Dick Fuld would have gotten the message.
I just point out that the Community Reinvestment Act, while it has its problems, was about discrimination in housing. And if you read the vast testimony that went into that law, testimony in 75 for a law in 77, it was about racial discrimination in housing. And that's wrong. It's wrong to have that discrimination. The big boost, as Bill was saying, to have home ownership for people at the expense of sound underwriting of mortgages or of truthful mortgage applications, that is also wrong, and we should not have pushed so hard in that particular direction. That's for sure.
When I was writing House of Cards, I went one day down to Baltimore for a day. Now, Baltimore is a tough place, and there's a lot of people who can't afford homes, who having a tough go of it. So I wanted to go and find a place. I found this place that helps. Its whole function was to sort of be a halfway house between people who have sort of found themselves having mortgages that they couldn't pay, and they needed relief. Incredibly to me, and I don't understand this. If you're a corporation and you borrow money from a bank, or you borrow money from the public markets, and you want to renegotiate the terms of those credit agreements or that indenture, you can do that. You can either do it by going voluntarily to your creditors and saying, I want to renegotiate and cut a new deal. That's called a voluntary restructuring. You can do it through Chapter 11, as Donald Trump has done 4 times, and he's so proud of it. You can renegotiate the terms of these agreements, but you cannot renegotiate the terms of a mortgage. That is insane, which you should be able to do, but you can't. And I don't know why you can't. I don't know why it's like that.
No, you can. You can. You're right. It's that it didn't happen. It didn't happen, and that's what's terrible.
So I went down to this place, and so I spent a lot of time there, and I saw people coming in every 5 minutes talking about how they needed relief on their mortgages. And then I started going through these stacks of mortgage applications, to your point. And what happened was, unfortunately, that time and time and time again, these charlatans at the mortgage companies who knew that the Wall Street firms were going to buy their mortgages as soon as they made them, created all of these BS mortgages. And they mandated by the Community Reinvestment Act, they went into these communities and said, human nature, again, is very simple, very simple. If you give somebody a free option, they're going to take it. So you go to somebody who's been renting and you say, have I got a deal for you? I'm going to lend you all the money you need so you can buy your home. That's the American dream, isn't it? You want to buy your home. That's what Bill Clinton says. That's what George Bush says. You want to own your home to be part of the American dream. Of course I want to own my home but I can't afford it. Don't worry about that. We'll give you all the money you need. Do you have a job? Don't worry about that. Do you have net income? Don't worry about that. Do you have collateral? Don't worry about that. So all of these loan applications were filled out and they were all a bunch of lies. And then the problem was that the mortgage lender would sign it and so would the borrower. Now that's where, of course, I wouldn't sign a mortgage agreement with fictitious information on it, but there are people who do. There are people who've been given free options and they take them. And what's the worst that can happen? They live in the home, they don't pay the mortgage, they can live there for 3 years because that's how long it takes to foreclose on it and get them out. And by then, by the way, that mortgage is packaged up and sold into security and sliced and diced and sold all over the world because of the incentive system from the mortgage brokers and on Wall Street to create securities out of them. So yes, you're right. Discrimination in lending is a horrible thing, but so is fictitious mortgage documents.
We probably should make this the last question. Thank you.
Bernie Sanders says the thing to do is to force the big banks to be broken up. What's wrong with that picture?
Well, again, in my judgment, I'm talking too much. I'm sorry, but in my judgment, Bernie Sanders says the big banks should be broken up. What's wrong with that? In my judgment, we don't want to live in a world where banks are not functioning. Look, the whole debate has gotten so, most people have no idea what a bank does or how Wall Street functions. And by the way, I blame Wall Street for that. They've created black boxes around what they do. They talk in a language that nobody can understand. And they do that intentionally because it serves their purpose to make, they have their own language. Now, I spent 20 years there and I understand their language and they can't fool me and I know exactly what's going on and I know exactly how banks work and I know exactly how securities firm works. The truth is that we want these banks to be big, actually, and we want them to be big because, first of all, the banks they compete against all over the world are big. Okay? So we have a real competitive advantage in this country with our banking system. They're in better financial shape because they've got more capital. There's more intellectual capital here. We're still the leaders in innovation, even though there hasn't been any lately.
Payments.
In payments, there's a reason that New York is the home of Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase. All of the strongest banks in the world and the leading banks in the world, the number one underwriters, the number one advisory firms, all of that are here. It's because the best and the brightest are here. That's all good. And we want that to be the same. If we break these banks up, by the way, Bernie doesn't even know what he's talking about when he says to break up the banks. If you go to his website and dig deep into what he's even talking about, he has no idea. There's no explanation. But it's a great punchline. Believe me, it's the fabulous punchline. The millionaires and billionaires, it's great. And it brings the people out in throngs, and he's been very successful. And I even voted for him in the New York primary. So I'm not saying I don't like him. I like his energy. He reminds me of my uncle. It's great stuff, okay? But he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. And we don't, not we, the world. The world now is a capitalist world, okay? That's the way it all functions. We need these banks to provide the grease for our functioning economies. And unfortunately, the regulators and people and these politicians have started to throw sand in the gears of capitalism. They're gumming it up. And that's not good. We need these banks to do what they're supposed to do, which is brilliant. It's brilliant. Taking money from people who have it, us, who are savers, and providing it to people who need it, borrowers, people who are running companies who want to take that capital and use it to build new plant and equipment, to hire more people, to pay higher wages, to innovate new products. I mean, there's a reason that Google and Facebook and Disney and all these great companies are here, because We have provided them the capital, the innovation, the climate, and we've created a lot of wealth as a society. This thing, I don't know if you guys like this thing. This is the greatest thing to have ever been produced. One of the greatest things ever. Our world has been transformed by this. I don't think we really, I mean, it's not all good, by the way. And our kids just stare at it, you know, mindlessly, and it's, you know, we should be reading more, believe me. I want people to read more because I write books, okay? On the other hand, this is possible because of Wall Street. And if you like this, you have to be a fan of Wall Street. And if you break up the big banks and you destroy Wall Street, we're not going to have things like this anymore. And neither is anybody else in the world. And I don't really think we want to live in a world like that. I'm sorry.
So I get to have the last word. So to-year question. Dodd-Frank has some good elements in it, not 2,200 pages or 1,100 pages or whatever it is. But one of the things is that living will. If you want to be big, you've got to demonstrate that you can be failed, that you can go to the bankruptcy court and be taken care of. That's the test. And that forces firms to ask, how do I simplify my structure? How do I operate in a way where I'm less interconnected? All that gives them the choice to figure it out, rather than just saying, let's just break it up into some arbitrary pieces. That I agree with Bill. We live in a world of big companies. Mom and pop stores are Walmarts and Targets today. You need to have capacity to be able to intermediate in financial markets. But you cannot leave a mess behind. That's the message of Title I of Dodd-Frank.
And the only rebut
Of course.
I would make to
Of
that,
course.
yeah, because I talk a lot and too much and too opinionated. Okay. Yes. Okay. I'll rebut, and then you'll ask the final question. Is okay? I won't rebut.
Securities, there were AAA, there was never a problem. The yield wasn't fantastic, but it was working really well. And then all of a sudden, no more, because there are so many people who aren't making money in this country, and they couldn't make these large purchases. So one of the reasons that the CDOs came about was to provide these mortgages so that people that really didn't make any money and didn't have any collateral could buy a house. But then it started spreading to the AAA tranches, because even people who were secure and had good mortgages and good credit, they were losing their jobs too. And there's a lot of reasons here for this failure. It's not just in the banking industry. We had free trade agreements that took well-paying jobs out of the country. And my other question is the recapitalization. It's made with fiat dollars, and the fiat dollar is money, but it's also debt. So we're creating more and more debt, are we not? And the recapitalization, or the insolvency rather, of the banks, you're saying that would come out of equity. It comes out of the shareholders. The shareholders are our savings to us. We will use our savings in the bank. That's the reordering. That's what people don't know. We're also talking about doing away with physical cash and negative interest rates. That means we're entrapped. We have to put our money in the bank. Then we have negative interest rates. And then we have the bail in. And we also have a credit to debt ratio of, this is 700 trillion global debt ratio because of the CBO's failure in particular these synthetic. It's 700 trillion debt to 75 trillion collateral. So can you comment how this came about? Also because we have a fiat dollar system, but how do we have to get back to a commodity backed currency besides a dollar currency. So how do you suggest that we go back to that? Is that another story for another day?
I think you said it. Your last point. I mean, a lot of issues all kind of wrapped into one there.
Anything? Could you tell me anything?
Well, I mean, again, you conflated a lot of different things. in one. I mean, I guess I would say that personally, I think that if, it's the Fed's job. William McChesney Martin, right? Great Fed, chairman of the Fed in the 1940s, said it's the Fed's job to take the punch bowl away as the party's getting started. If we'd only go back to that, I think we would be better off. Sam Zell, we can end on this. Sam Zell is like one of my favorite businessmen. He's so smart. He's made so much money. He hasn't done everything right, but he's outspoken. He takes no prisoners. He's great. Shouldn't ride motorcycles, but whatever. He said yesterday, I think, that when you price something at zero, people value it at zero. When the Fed prices capital at zero, people have no respect for it. It doesn't cost them anything. They can fool around with it. They can speculate with it. And that's what you have now. We've had zero interest rates since 2008. That's not going to end well. I'm sorry. Not going to end well. Okay, thank you all very much.